If you were a billionaire, how much would you spend on your wedding? $100,000? $1 million? How about $1 billion, as in billion with a B? Because that's how much this wedding was rumored to cost in 2016. And I don't know about you, but this wedding, which was for the son of a Russian billionaire, was just a little more extravagant than the weddings I've been to before. From a $26,000 wedding dress that was so decked out in beads that it weighed 28 pounds, which, okay, imagine it's your wedding day, you're nervous, you're glammed up, and now you have to lug around some CrossFit weight everywhere, to performances by J-Lo, Sting, and Enrique Iglesias, to a wedding cake that I want so badly to jump on because look at it. Does that not look like the fluffiest sweet pillow you could possibly dive into? And though I'm guessing most of us are not going to be spending $1 billion on a wedding, according to a recent report by CNN, the average amount spent on American weddings in 2023 is $29,000, which is still quite a hefty amount, with 28% of US couples going into debt to pay for their weddings, according to Business Insider. And it's not just an American thing. The same Business Insider article broke down other countries' average wedding costs and found that in Peru and Brazil, a whopping 47% of couples reported going into debt to pay for their weddings. But it's a wedding, right? I mean, sure, there's a big check to cut and it can be wildly stressful to plan, but that's what we do for weddings. It's tradition, it's what we see in movies and online, it's just the way things are. But maybe it doesn't have to be. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about how perception and comparison, especially in the age of social media, has led us down a path of wedding excess. Let's talk about how companies can reinforce these feelings and how that social pressure to have the perfect wedding can translate to financial pressure, aka how weddings keep you poor. But first off, if you are new here, hi, I'm Cara. I make bi-weekly video essays on the intersection of money, media, and intentional living. And if that sounds like your cup of tea, you might like some of my other video essays, like my most recent one, How Discounts Keep You Poor. So go check out that one after you're done with this video. And just like how eloping can give you more privacy in your relationship, today's sponsor, Delete Me, can give you more privacy with your online information. You guys know that I love Delete Me, and I've been using it for months now to help me protect my personal information from getting all over the internet. Especially as someone who is online and a bit of a public persona, it's really important for me to protect my personal information to avoid being harassed or doxxed in any way. But even beyond that, I have had members of my own family who have dealt with things like identity theft, and it is an absolute nightmare, which is why I think Delete Me is so incredible. For those who don't know, Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that will remove your personal information that's being sold online. Information like your name, current and former addresses, email addresses, age, and phone numbers. When you sign up with Delete Me, they'll send you a Delete Me privacy report, indicating where they've found your information and what's being done to remove that information. From there, you get one every 3 months so you can continue keeping your information private. My most recent report came back last month with a total of 4,664 listings reviewed, 90 listings with my information removed, and 50 different data brokers who had been sharing my personal information. If you're interested in getting your own detailed report and having your personal information stay private, you can use my discount code CARA, C-A-R-A, for 20% off. That's code CARA at joindeleteme.com/Cara, which I'll link down below. Thank you so much to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. So let's first talk about how perception and comparison have turned weddings into the financial monstrosities that we see today. Because one of the things I found most interesting while researching for this video is that weddings were not always like this. Marriage traditions have historically been much more humble affairs, from having receptions at home to wedding outfits that are simply favorite picks from your closet instead of something new. Now, obviously, that hasn't always been the case for royals and nobles, but let's remember that just 200 years ago, over 75% of humanity lived in extreme poverty versus 10% today. So we're talking most people having quite the humble wedding compared to the $30,000 people splash on weddings nowadays. Zooming in, the famous motifs that we often associate with weddings these days are relatively new when you consider the long history of marriage traditions. The white wedding dress, for example, which is extremely popular in Western weddings, only became a thing after Queen Victoria wore a white gown for her 1840 wedding to Prince Albert. Before and around that time, European and American brides wore a whole range of colors like black, brown, gray, blue, and yellow. The same goes for the diamond, which is now regarded as a modern symbol of love and the one jewel people flock to for engagement rings. In the early 20th century, the diamond company De Beers launched what is now considered one of the most effective marketing campaigns of all time, the A Diamond is Forever campaign transformed consumer sentiment around diamonds so that people felt like it was the ultimate gift of love, a symbol for the eternal aspirations of marriage. As this HubSpot piece explains, quote, "The concept of an engagement ring had existed since medieval times, but it had never been widely adopted, and before World War II, only 10% of engagement rings contained diamonds. However, these days, 85% of US engagement rings contain diamonds." Quite the jump, especially since this rare stone is not actually that rare, but that's a story for another day. So what does the relatively recent popularity of white wedding dresses and diamond engagement rings have to do with how weddings keep us poor? In the case of white wedding dresses, we see an example of how social trends influence us into material trappings that we might not have chosen for ourselves otherwise. And in the case of diamond engagement rings, we see how emotion can be weaponized against us to buy more than we may truly want or need.
How else could 2 months' salary last forever? A diamond is forever. De Beers.
I think the combination of social pressure and narratives wrapped in emotion have this really weird effect on us, where we feel like the extravagance of a wedding or the money that we pour into it is a direct reflection of the love in our relationship. Not to mention, we as humans are drawn to signaling status. We do it in so many ways, through the schools we go to, the vacations we take, the luxury goods we buy, even through the less conventional ways, like what level of Valorant you are. The social comparison theory, developed by social psychologist Leon Festinger, suggests that people determine their own social and personal worth based on how they stack up against others. A wedding serves as an easy benchmark to show your friends, your family, and all your followers on Instagram from high school just how well you're doing these days.
But
Evan, you can just say it. Just
I want our wedding to be the best wedding of all the ones that we've been to.
All of this can lead to us feeling like the number of flowers at our venue, or the table setting's aesthetic, or the beauty of the wedding dress aren't simply flowers, a location, and a piece of clothing, but instead a representation of our social status, our success in life, our character, and our relationships' very health. Not gonna lie, that is a whole lot of pressure to put on peonies. And did I write that line just because I adore alliteration? Yes, I did. And look, I think a lot of this comes from the way that we tell our love stories in movies and media, where we put the wedding as this third act finale. For those who are unfamiliar with the 3-act structure, it's a model where we tend to divide our stories into 3 parts: the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning is where your love interests may first meet. The middle is where they may date or break up or run into some other challenge with their relationship. And then the end is that sweet resolution of the problem, often signified by a wedding. Honestly, we see this beyond fiction too. I personally love watching The Bachelor and Bachelorette, but it's kind of crazy that the endings of these shows are framed as an engagement and wedding planning. Don't get me wrong, I get why we do this. It's an easy plot device that allows us to visually show abstract concepts like love and commitment. If you're making a fun rom-com, the clean-cut visual language of a wedding makes do quite well. But the problem is that because we frame weddings as a love story's happily ever after, and film studios have a very different kind of budget than the average person out there, we end up with normalized wedding representations that are grossly expensive and out of reach for most people. On top of all that, humans love stories. It's the way that we make sense of the world. Because of that, and like I mentioned before, I think that we subconsciously internalize the notion that the wedding is this directly correlated stand-in for love. As in, the more money that goes into the wedding, the more love there must be. And the wedding industry knows that we buy into these messages, so they prey on and reinforce these very feelings. Ads galore that sell us fairy tale love centered around weddings, higher prices on wedding services like videographers and caterers, the pushing of new traditions and things you have to do for your wedding, therefore continually moving the goalpost for what feels like a great wedding. And social media is only worsening all of these feelings for our weddings. Cue the too many to count Pinterest perfect weddings out there, with the stunning backdrops, the forest of perfectly budded flowers, the aesthetic candles and Christmas lights. I'm not gonna lie, I 100% want to jump into the vibes of these photos because they look amazing. But like I've said in some other videos before, I just think we know way too much about each other. In the olden days, we would have only seen the weddings we were invited to, but now we have access to witnessing nearly every person person's wedding in the world who has internet, including royalty, as in a royal wedding. There is no way that if I was born a few hundred years ago, I was seeing a royal wedding, because statistically speaking, I was most likely to be a peasant who died in infancy, so that sight was just not in my cards. But now I know the wedding venue of my old babysitter from growing up. I know my old classmate from 3rd grade's wedding dress, and I can watch every millionaire or billionaire on social media have a glamorous wedding montage that I could never afford. And yes, I'm thinking of the cake again, because I want to jump in it. Please. Comparison is hard to avoid with social media because its frequently visual medium often encourages the commodification of experiences. Think family vloggers and the way every life moment becomes content. Weddings are no exception, whether you're a vlogger or not. There's pressure for our experiences to be perfect to begin with, and this is only heightened with the high stakes of a wedding. This makes it so easy to feel like every detail, from the table decor to the save the date letter, needs to be perfect, which only leads us to spend more money trying to achieve perfection. By the way, and I know this is not a unique question at all, but why do we have a save the date letter and an RSVP letter? Because it feels like we're repeating work here. I get it, technically they're different, but it feels like just one could do. But I digress.
All right, today's wedding planning question is a really important one. Can I explain the difference between invitations and save the dates? And do I really need to do both? Yes, you do need to do both.
No, but seriously, let's just collectively agree to get rid of one of these suckers, please. Okay, but hold on a second. I do want to stop myself here because some of these things I'm talking about, like the wedding industrial complex and social pressures on weddings, they feel a little provocative. I'm framing it in a very antagonistic way, and I think it's missing a lot of nuance here. Because the idea that the wedding industrial complex is preying on and reinforcing narratives of love being equated with spending money sounds a whole lot more nefarious and conspiratorial than what I really mean. I'm guessing some people are going to be a little ticked off with what I'm about to say, but I think it is an important piece to note. I personally don't subscribe to a lot of the online discourse that likes to frame corporations as these evil entities that are manipulating us all as consumers. This may or may not come as a surprise to those who watch my videos, but I think a lot of times some folks misinterpret my videos, especially when they're about overconsumption and spending money. Because look, it's easy to say, capitalism's bad, we're victims being manipulated by companies. But I think that framing takes away so much of our agency as consumers. It shirks us of our consumer responsibility that I think we can and we should take very seriously. At the end of the day, we have to fess up to the fact that, at least when it comes to weddings, we choose to buy into these social traditions. Yes, sometimes it's made much harder by family or cultural pressure, and yes, there are so many influences around us that encourage us to go into debt for a wedding, but ultimately we have decision-making power, and companies, as happens in a capitalist system, want to align with consumer demand signals. If we're consistently signaling that we want to and are willing to pay for more and more extravagance for our weddings, the wedding industrial complex will of course supply us with that. To me, we shouldn't expect companies in the wedding industry to not advertise their products, or movies to not use weddings as an easy plot device, or celebrities to not post their wedding photos online. Even the price hikes for those wedding specific services like videography or caterers like I mentioned before, I can understand the premiums that they might add and why they do that, because it tends to be a little higher stakes if you're a service provider providing for a wedding. I say this all to help us internalize that while weddings are an enormous financial burden for many, they don't have to be. We have a cultural obsession with spending money on weddings. I'm not assigning a positive or negative emotion to that, and personally I'm not married and I might spend tens of thousands of dollars on my wedding, or I might not. The message of how weddings keep us poor isn't to shame people who have spent a lot on a wedding, but to help all of us feel more empowered to be smart, intentional consumers when it comes to our weddings, so that we can be aware when our impulse to spend that extra grand on a wedding dress is actually coming from emotionally driven influences that don't align with our personal values, so that we can more thoughtfully weigh the balance between investing in an experience versus investing in our financial futures. There isn't a right number for this. There's no perfect calculation that tells you how much you should spend on a wedding, because every couple is different. But how weddings keep us poor is an important idea to keep in mind, because the enormous costs associated with weddings can also be a life-altering amount when invested into your financial future. That TV show Marriage or Mortgage is one of the clearest examples of this. The premise, for those who don't know, is that a couple must choose between using their savings for either a wedding or the mortgage for a new home. Like I said before, we're not here to assign judgment on which option is the the better of the two. But it's interesting to think about how choosing mortgage sets a couple up for a much more financially secure position, which can translate into less financial pressure for the marriage itself. For those who are planning a wedding or who will plan one day, thinking about wedding costs in this way might be really helpful. The money you save on a more frugal wedding doesn't only have to be framed as the things you're not getting on your wedding day, but it can also be framed as the things you're receiving for the marriage itself. It is a gift that you are giving you and your future spouse. More peace of mind, fewer financial stresses, an earlier retirement even. If we take that $29,000 the average American spends on their wedding and we cut it in half, and then we invest that $14,500 into something like the S&P 500, after 30 years at the S&P 500's historical average rate of return of 10%, you would end up with over $250,000. That number represents years more of retirement you might be able to have, more vacations, more financial security. Not to mention, having a less fancy wedding might be a nice thing for your guests too, since a recent Bankrate study found that the average wedding guest plans to spend an average of $611 per wedding this year. That is a lot of money for a wedding that is not even yours. Look, I understand that weddings are incredibly personal, and it isn't for me, some random video essay lady on the internet, to say what you should and you shouldn't do with your wedding. But know that there is a world beyond the flashy depictions of weddings that we see across media. There are countless examples of beautiful yet inexpensive weddings like this one where the couple paid only $200 for their wedding venue. And know that the amount of money that you spend on your wedding is not a reflection of the happiness, the success, or the love that's to come in your marriage. But what do you think? Are you someone who wants an extravagant wedding, or are you more on the frugal side? And what do you think about the whole cultural obsession we have with spending money on weddings? Let me know your thoughts down below, and if you like this video, you might like my other video essays like how designer brands keep you poor or how discounts keep you poor. Thank you so much to those who support my channel on Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.